And we're recording. Holy shit. It's been a long journey. It's been 4 weeks full of ups and downs, ins and outs. One of us had a baby. Neither of us got any sleep. And we've learned a lot about brewing, a lot about love. And stoked to have everyone back here for the last session of Wort Wranglin with Wade, at least for now. We're going to keep the whole dialed in thing going. We have some fun things coming up. We're going to be doing some bingo, which will be called by David Franz of New Belgium fame, actually, with winners and everything. It's going to be a blast. We'll have that coming up soon. We're also going to do more industry facing. We're going to expand the industry roundtable. We did one as one of the first few that we did, but we're going to go more granular with it. And instead, we are going to have one focusing on the on-premise world and one on the off-premise world with some really cool guests that I'm super stoked to have on board. Some people who really know their stuff and who are staples in the Colorado scene and who can speak to all that as well. So if you are in the industry on either side and you might be interested in kind of hearing everyone talk about what the post-COVID world looks like, we're not going to linger on the negative bullshit. We're going to look at what we can do to all move forward positively together. Keep an eye out for those in the next few weeks. As always, my name is Jake Goodman. I help out with the marketing side of things and a few other things as well at WeldWerks Brewing in sunny Greeley, Colorado. With me today, as always, is the venerable Wade Meyer, who is one of our brewers, a new daddy for the second time now. And he's got a great pedigree behind him as far as homebrewing goes. And he's just a rock solid dude who knows his shit backwards and forwards about a whole lot of things. One of them, of course, being brewing and homebrewing as well. So let's just dive right into it. We're going to leave maybe about 20 minutes at the end just to see if there's kind of any big random questions that folks want to go into specifically about homebrewing, of course. But even if there's any questions that you have about our takes on the industry right now, how things are, WeldWerks, what's coming up, what's shaking, and anything you're curious about, both Wade and I would be happy to wax, well, not poetic, but hopefully not stupid either. So that's going to be we're going to set the bar low, and if we get over it, then hey, it's all butter, right? So without further ado, I welcome one more time to the podium, Mr. Wade Meyer. Wade, how you doing, sir?
Good, man. How are you?
I'm delightful because this beer is fucking awesome, and I'm really excited that I snagged a 4-pack of it before it departs very quickly. How's your sleep level?
It's low, but it's getting there. So
Good.
I'm drinking a Tank 11, so it's pretty damn good.
Beautiful, 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 beautiful. So I think we're going to start today kind of like we did last time. We're not going to go anywhere near as in depth because we really did a deep dive on the equipment last time. Again, as always, any questions that you have as they're coming up, just shoot them into the chat. Shoot them out to everybody so everyone can kind of see what's on the docket. If they fit into the current conversation, or we can wrap back around to them easily, I'll shove them in where appropriate. If not, we'll just kind of push them more towards the end and keep them categorized up until then. But we did a big deep dive on equipment last time, which was super interesting, and I think folks got a lot out of. We're not going to go that bonkers on it, but there are, once you've gotten past that kind of that intermediate level, there's definitely some equipment upgrades that can be done. And let's start it out philosophically again, Wade. You're jumping. We're differentiating an intermediate course from an advanced course, and I know that's very fungible, and there's different ways that you can probably define or look at those two categories. But in your mind, what's the main one or two differentiating factors where you can look at your work or your processes or your equipment or all three or what have you and say, okay, I can consider myself a pretty advanced home brewer now? What does that look like as compared to this more intermediate world?
Yeah, so I think what I would differentiate it with is you're really going to focus more on technique and being advanced. You're going to be starting doing quite a few more challenging stuff as far as mash is concerned with decoctions and turbid mashes if you're into mixed culture stuff, which we'll go over. And really it's just about fine-tuning your technique. There's a few equipment things like we talked about that, are completely unnecessary at this point. But if you really like to geek out, they can definitely be beneficial. And I think really it's more about fine tuning that technique and really just challenging yourself on new things and maybe even bringing back old techniques.
That's great. So let's dive into the equipment side of things. I think we're looking at maybe some glycol, looking at different types of tanks. I know people were interested in you talking about the Raspberry Pi and how you utilize that in your own work at home. So why don't you just go ahead and dive in, man?
Yeah, so we'll start off with glycol. We pretty much went over it last time, but basically it is a standalone cooling system that has a refrigerated liquid glycol that you pump through your vessel, obviously not with the beer, but it controls your temperature. It's very beneficial if you don't have a consistent environment, such as me. I brew in my garage, so right now I've got a beer over there fermenting at 67 degrees, even though it's probably 85 in my garage. The benefits of it are it's extremely efficient, and you really don't have to mess with it. It's a standalone system that takes care of itself as far as keeping it cold. Downsides are they are pretty expensive. They're coming down in price, and there's a few manufacturers out there that you can get them through, and they do work extremely well, though. So with glycol, we went over it a lot in the intermediate, but that's pretty much the upsides to it. Downsides are it's expensive. The other thing with the Raspberry Pi, so I use a Raspberry Pi to control my fermentation. Basically, I use a program called Craft Beer Pi. It's a free program that you can install. And a Raspberry Pi, if you're not familiar, is basically just a little standalone computer chip. It uses Linux, which can be challenging if you're not computer savvy. I am definitely not that computer savvy. So nice thing is there's a lot of write-ups on it and a lot of information that you can get fairly easy to do a step-by-step install. It's not that difficult. So I wouldn't say that it's hard and you have to learn programming by any means. Basically, all that is a fancy PID. So that controls the temperature. It will turn off before it actually hits that temperature. That's what a PID does. So basically, it doesn't subcool or overheat. I see some comments. I use a Raspberry Pi 3. There's the new ones too, Raspberry Pi 3 Plus, I believe, and 4 even maybe. But I think 3 is the base one that you have to have. You do also have to have a few other pieces, such as I use a solid state relay system for mine. And basically all it does is it controls an outlet. So it will turn on an outlet via the relay, and then that outlet controls the pump, which activates the glycol to go through the tank. So it's really simple. The benefits of the Raspberry Pi that I found are you can access it anywhere in the world through a VPN. So it's really cool. Like I'll be at work and I'll be like, okay, I think I'll take a sample to work, I'll test it, and I'll be like, all right, it's time to cold crash, and I'll just cold crash while I'm at work, which is pretty cool. And you can also see if it's down, which is pretty cool. So they're definitely interesting, and they're, once again, completely unnecessary, and Inkbird would work just as well. But it's a fun little toy, so to speak. The other piece of equipment, and pretty much the last one that we'll go over, is going to be a bright tank. So SS Brewtech, I know, makes one. That's the one I have. A bright tank, basically, it's just a place where you condition your beer. You can also carbonate it through a carb stone. It's a porous stone that will make tinier bubbles of CO2. The smaller the bubble and the colder the liquid, the faster it will carbonate. So you can carbonate it in there and store it in there and keep it cold. You can even serve off it if you want to. They're pretty cool. I use it mostly for my lagers just to free up that fermenter. But they are definitely useful for your application if you decide that you want to do lagers or you just want to free up your fermenter. They're really cool. Yeah, that's pretty much it on equipment.
Sweet. James just had a question. Is there much benefit to conditioning in a bright versus a uni after dropping the yeast?
I don't really think so. They're pretty much the same. The only benefit you're really going to have is to free up that vessel. So, they're a little bit cheaper, I believe, than unit tanks. So you can free it up, and if you don't want to invest into another unit tank, but honestly, I got it really cheap. Otherwise, I probably would have just bought another conical or unit tank, just because then you have another fermenter. There's probably some more, based on the design of the tank and the geometry of the tank, some more benefits to it. but pretty much like both have true bottoms, so you can both dump all the true you want off of it, and so they'll both work extremely well.
Awesome. All right, so I mean, let's get into the meat of it, man. You know, I know at least when I think of advanced, I'm thinking more advanced techniques, kind of bringing in more nuance, bringing in just more tools in the toolbox, so to speak. I know you want to talk about kettle sours and mixed cultures. Just jump in wherever you want. There were some questions previously submitted as far as recipe formulation and whatnot, but we can probably hold off on those for a little bit because we did talk about it last time a touch, at least as far as logging recipes and whatnot. Maybe later on we can talk just a touch about how you maybe refine some of those recipes and some of the extra tweaks you can make at this stage. But for now, let's get into kettle. You want to start with kettle souring?
Yeah, so kettle souring, I mean, we've seen it lately. They're becoming huge. I believe they sell better than our IPAs even right now.
Oh, yeah.
So they're a huge thing, and I think they're here to stay. Just the main benefit of the kettle sour, the main thing that differentiates it from like a mixed culture or a regular sour, is going to be the fact that you're going to kill the bacteria that you're souring with before you actually put it in the fermenter, which on a professional level is extremely useful because you're not putting active live cultures, bacteria, in your tanks that if you don't kill when you clean it, it can infect other beers that you don't intend to be sour. So that's really the benefit of a kettle sour. So what you're really going to do is you're going to make wort like you normally would. Typically, our grist bill, I believe, is pretty high in wheat. So you're going to make your normal wort just like you normally would. You're not going to add any hops. So if you add hops to your kettle sour before like your first wort or your 60-minute, you're going to stunt or even possibly completely negate any of the bacteria because hops are a preservative. So we actually don't add any hops to the wort at this point. You're going to boil it. We boil for 10 to 15 minutes just to kill any natural bacteria that's in the grain. And then you're going to add your culture. The most popular one and the one that we use for a long time is going to be Good Belly. It's a probiotic that has plantarum in it, which is a type of bacteria that produces lactic acid. And that's really what you're going after is that lactic acid. That's what makes it a kettle sour. So you pitch that. You don't cool it down, or you don't want to have it too hot. You don't want to have it too cold. I usually shoot for around 100 to 110 degrees and then pitch it. It likes to be warm. It'll work faster that way. And the more you pitch, the faster it will work. But you can definitely go too far. I would say, I don't know, we pitch a quart per barrel roughly is what we do. So you can scale that down to a 5-gallon batch would be like a fifth of a quart. And I know they make smaller ones. We just always buy the quarts. So you really don't need that much Good Belly, and it will propagate and just work. It will just be a little bit slower. The flavor doesn't really matter that much, we found. You can add the strawberry banana or the mango or the blueberry, and they're pretty much all the same. So you're going to pitch that in, and then you're going to let it sit. A lot of people do a CO2 blanket where they actually put CO2 on top of the kettle to kind of create a barrier from the oxygen. It definitely works. We did it for a while, and then we tried it without it, and we, on our system, didn't notice any bit of a difference. So I don't really think it's super necessary, but you can definitely mess with that and just try putting some CO2 on it. If you have like a little hose, you can bleed some on it for a little bit, and then just put a lid on it, let it be. A lot of people will wrap the kettle in a blanket or a sleeping bag to keep it warm. If you have an electric system, that's where those really come in handy because you can just set it to 100 degrees and it'll kick on that element for a little bit and keep it warm. But if you don't, a blanket would work fine. Or if you do it in the summer, it's probably going to hold pretty good consistency for the temperature. Plantarum really works well anywhere from 90 to 110 is its like sweet spot where it really takes after it. But it still will sour even if it gets a little lower. Then you're basically going to taste it. If it's the sour that you want, you go ahead and fire up your boil. You're going to boil we do 30 minutes. You can do up to an hour. Pitch your hops at that point, do your boil, and knock it out like normal. The nice thing is, like I said, all of your bacteria is killed, so you don't have to worry about anything getting into your fermenter, which is super nice because it's basically a clean beer at that point, just with this acidity already. Yeast, a lot of people are worried about yeast health with that, being it'll be a lower pH. If you do have a pH meter, we usually shoot for around 3.2 to 3.3. It really, acidity and sourness isn't dependent on the number. So really tasting it is the best way to do it. But, you know, those are good numbers to shoot for. So yeah, then you can add your fruit if you're going to do that type of thing, or do a Berliner. Berliners typically will have, traditionally they'll have like a fruit pump they'll add fruit to the glass actually, and different spices to the glass when you're actually serving the beer. So you just have a base sour beer with almost no flavor in it, and then you add the fruit syrup or whatever you want at the end as you're drinking it, which is pretty cool. But yeah, so that's kettle sours. Mixed culture sours are a little bit different. Once again, they're going to be active and alive. There's a couple different major players in that, Brett being one of them. Britannomyces is a wild yeast that produces a lot of funk. A lot of people call it barnyard, horse blanket. It's just a really funky beer. It's probably my favorite style of beers are Brett beers, just because they're so different in depth. And Brett will eat anything. So if you have a pretty bad beer, you can throw some Brett in that beer and see what it does, and chances are it's going to take a lot of those flavors that you don't like out of that beer and use it to produce some really cool and interesting different flavors. There's a couple ways of doing mixed cultures. One of them is to buy manufactured strains that you can get that are pure from a lab. That's a really good way to do it starting out. It's definitely the most consistent because you know you're going to get a pure strain and nothing crazy. So those are really where I tend to lead people right off the bat if you want to do some mixed culture stuff. And a lot of the times what I'll do is I'll brew a normal clean beer and then put it in a wooden barrel. You can find some bourbon barrels in 5, 10, 15 gallon sizes that are really cool. If you have a local distillery, they're really cool. Especially micro ones will have a lot of those little barrels. They tend to be a little bit more expensive. You're probably going to be looking around $100 for one, but they are really cool to use. And I'll brew a clean beer, throw my strain in there with it, so that way I'm not infecting my equipment. And then you let it ride for a little bit. The smaller the barrel, and we'll get into this more on barrel aging stuff, but the smaller the barrel, the more surface area it has towards the wood, so the faster it's going to age. So really, if you have a 5-gallon barrel, you really don't want it in there more than 6 months. It's gonna have a lot of oxygen intake through those staves, and it's gonna develop really quickly. So after about a month or two, I'd start testing it and tasting it weekly. It's very, very important to do that, so that way you don't have an extended period of time where the beer just gets oxidized. Also with mixed culture stuff, it's very important to keep your stuff separated. So if you have different sampling wine thieves or anything like that, definitely mark them, because you don't want to use them for your clean beer and your sour beer, because you will infect stuff. And if you're using a plastic buckets, that's really bad because you really can't disinfect those. Stainless steel conicals, if you do a really heavy caustic clean on it with PBW, or if you can get your hands on something a little stronger, you can kill Brett. It's pretty difficult, but you can. High heat will also kill it. But it's important to just safeguard yourself and keep that sour equipment separate from your other equipment. But the other way to capture some mixed culture stuff is spontaneous stuff, which is pretty cool. It's something that I'm starting to dive pretty heavily into, because it's one of those things where you're capturing wild yeast and bacteria from the air. It's a pretty famous brewery. Cantillon it's really known for lambic, and Cantillon from Belgium is probably the oldest one. Dre Fontaine is also a really big one. But lambic style is all spontaneous, so you don't actually pitch any yeast. You're creating that wort, and then you let it naturally cool during certain seasons where it's cold at night, but not too cold. It's usually fall and spring. And it naturally cools that down and kills all the bad bacteria that you want, or mostly you don't want. And then you get this natural latoire, like just the environment that you live in will produce this beer. It's really cool, and it's something that is a whole, like, you can go deep into it. One resource that's extremely valuable is called Milk the Funk. They have as much information as you want on lambics and on creating spontaneous stuff and mixed culture stuff. They're a very excellent resource. But with spontaneous stuff, one problem is you don't have any control over what you're pitching into it. So I think the average is about a third of the beer you make is good beer, and you'd end up dumping a lot of beer. If you're in Colorado, Black Project is pretty famous for their spontaneous stuff. They do a lot of really, really cool stuff down there. And then Speciation does a lot of really cool stuff. Fonta Flora does stuff. There's a lot of really cool Amlam. Jester King is another one. They do a lot of really cool Amlam, which is American lambic style stuff, because kind of like Champagne, it's only lambic if it's from the lambic region. So most of the stuff you're going to look for is going to be called Methode Traditionale. I think Jeff Stuffings came up with that terminology, basically from Jester King. Basically what it means is you're doing the exact same steps in the exact same way that the Belgians do it, but you're just not doing it in the lambic region. So if you can get some Methode stuff, it's really cool, and definitely check it out. There's some good stuff and there's some bad stuff, but it's all fun. But yeah, so that's kind of sours in a nutshell.
Thank you, man. I appreciate that. And I know that's just a style that seems to kind of wax and wane with popularity. It seems to people just go bonkers about it for a while. Maybe it's personal taste. I don't know. And then it just kind of fades up and then it fades down and then it fades back in again and it fades back down.
Yep.
But what always remains is that the producers of the style in the States that are notable, especially I think looks like Walrus mentioned DeGard. Folks like that, you don't have a bad beer. There's no such thing. It doesn't exist. So real quick before we jump into, I think we're gonna talk about turbid and decoction mashing and all that fun stuff. But there was a question that I think is super relevant and a lot of people are just generally curious right now, as the answer has shown, and 450 North, and our buddies at Burley Oak, and now, of course, WeldWerks, fruiting the shit out of stuff. Any tips along those lines for post-fermentation addition of fruit for these hyper-fruited styles? We're not talking, the apricot goza of old. We're talking the stuff that chose the line.
Yeah, so I mean, those are huge. I mean, Fruit Camp is our #1 beer probably right now. It's one of those things where it's a new and interesting style, and I think it gets a lot of beer drinkers on board that aren't necessarily beer drinkers. My sister-in-law absolutely loves them, and she will not touch anything that's even remotely close to even a pale ale on hop level. So it's one of those things that I think it's good and it's interesting. I think there's no such thing as bad beer. Beer's fun. I mean, do I call it beer? Yeah, because there's beer in it. But basically a little bit of what we do, because that's really all I can speak to. The way we do it, and we're hypersensitive to ABV now for some reasons. Basically, we will produce an extremely high ABV kettle sour, something in the range of around 12% usually. So what we're doing is we're creating that, knowing that we're going to back sweeten it with fruit. So we're going to ferment it out like normal, and then we're going to put it in the bright, and we're going to fruit the hell out of it. Typically, it's about half to maybe 60% fruit in these beers, and that'll take that 12% down to 5%. It can be tricky calculating that just on the volumes, but on a homebrew scale, I mean, you're not worried about ABVs. So the way I would do it is I would ferment it like normally. I would probably only produce a 3-gallon batch by making 5 gallons total. And then I would put the fruit in the keg, just like we put the fruit in the bright. The one thing that you're going to do differently than us is most likely you don't own a pasteurizer. So I don't own a pasteurizer, I know that. So what you're going to do is always want to keep that thing cold as you can possibly get it. All that's really going to do is stunt the yeast from fermenting it. You're going to have a ton of residual sugar from that fruit that if it gets warm enough for that yeast to wake up, it's going to ferment it. And if it's an enclosed place and it has no pressure relief, that's a bomb. There's no other way to say it. There's a lot of breweries that don't have a pasteurizer. And I don't knock them for still wanting to make these beers as long as they completely understand and make it apparent that you have to keep these things cold. We've all seen those pictures of cans that explode, and we've definitely had a few. I have on a consumer level where, you know, you need to keep them cold, and if you leave them out and they get rock hard, they're dangerous. So what I would recommend is put the fruit in the keg and then put your sour in there. You can kind of, what I would probably do is shake the hell out of it almost every time I'm going to serve it, because that fruit is going to settle out. And if you have a keg, or I would never put this stuff in bottles. I would never put a hyper fruited beer in bottles. The only thing worse than cans, in my opinion, is bottles. If you bottle this stuff, like, that's just a glass bomb. That's unsafe. So I would probably only do it if I'm kegging, and especially with a kegerator that has been consistent and that doesn't like trip a breaker in your house or something like that. If you have issues with your kegerator, I wouldn't really try that style. Maybe what you could do is have some fruit and you can mix it while you're pouring glasses. So Amaretti makes a craft puree. That's basically aseptic fruit. You can use those. You could put it in the glass in a pump style thing. That's a cool way to do it if you don't feel comfortable having this unfermented sugar kept cold in case something gets warm. But yeah, that's probably the tips I would say is do it in your keg and then make sure you shake that keg up to keep it settled and keep it, you know, nice, because that fruit's going to crash out and then you're just going to pour fruit. That's all it's really going to be. But if you mix it in a glass, that's a really good way to do it. But yeah, that's what I would do.
Heard. And again, any other questions like that, folks, please put them out there, even if they're not on the topic. If it has to do with anything fun that WeldWerks is doing at this point, we are pretty generally an open book. You know, we published the recipe to Juicy Bits really early on when no one really was asking for it or gave a shit necessarily. But I just checked the Craft Beer and Brewing put up the video for that. They made it free to everyone like a year ago or something like that. And it's got like 25,000 views or something like that, you know, which is nothing staggering by today's viral measures, but it's still, you know, folks have been interested in enough, and we are generally an open book. So, and we, if nothing else, we not only pride ourselves on the transparency, but enjoy the genuine interaction that comes about from answering, you know, honest questions, honestly, I guess. So, all right, so let's dive into one of the biggies, a turbid step decoction mash, some of that craziness.
Yeah, so real quick, I will say that all of our fruit camps are pasteurized. We do have a pasteurizer. So if you buy a fruit camp, I would still keep it cold just because it's better for the beer, but I wouldn't worry too much about it exploding. So yeah, just want to put that out there. So yeah, turbid, step, decoction matches. We'll kind of go in order of where you would want to use them. So the first is going to be a step mash. Basically, the difference is up to this point, we've really talked about single infusion mashes or one mash temperature. So that's either going to be anywhere from the range of 148 to 154 typically for your normal beers. A step mash, you're going to do different rests to activate different enzymes to convert different proteins. Really, really popular in the German styles, and it's really popular in traditional brewing. A lot of that has to do with the malts that we were using back in the day were under modified, so they didn't easily convert those starches to sugars. In today's world, most of those grains are going to be fine without doing a step mash, but it can be fun. I've done step mashes, and I think it does make a difference. So real quickly, a step mash, basically, you're going to typically do a 113 to 122. You can kind of depend on what you're trying to do, but you're going to start there, and then if you're doing infusion mashes where you're adding hot water, so you're going to do your initial calculations to mash in at like 113, right? And then you're going to add some hot water, some boiling water at a certain percentage to get you up to, it depends on how many steps you want to do, but if you're just doing one, up to your normal decoction, your 148, or your normal saccharification. So what you're doing there is you're converting down here, and then you're going back up to your saccharification rest where you're actually going to convert most of the proteins or most of the starches to sugars. So what that does is it can help with activating more sugars and having those beers dry out a little bit better. It can activate different proteins, which will give different flavors. Heth is a really popular one to do a step mash on. And it's just something fun to do. The next step is going to be a decoction mash, which is a type of a step mash. So in that's really where Heth and Pilsners and all those typical German beers are going to come into play. What you're actually going to do on a decoction mash is you're going to mash in at your normal lower temperature, your 113, something like that. And then you're going to pull some mash, grain and all, into your boil kettle and boil it. And what that does is it creates a melanoidin effect, or it can create, I can't remember the name of it, but basically it's where you cook something kind of like what you do with a steak, where it creates caramelization, creates a little bit of color, and yeah, Maillard. Thank you, Matthew. So Maillard effect, where you actually are creating some sugars and burning them into some caramelization, which adds flavor. Everyone loves a nice seared steak. And you're going to boil those, and that also will damage the cell walls of that grain and allow it to release a little bit better. So you're going to boil that off, and then you're going to put it back in the mash, and that's going to raise it up. And then typically it's a 2 or 3 step, so you'll do it again and then pull it back in. Hef is a really, really popular one for this. And I know as well for Pilsners, all of beer sauce stuff is decoction mash. It can be difficult on a homebrew scale. Probably the best way to do it is just get a big scoop or a big pitcher and try and scoop some out and do it that way is probably the easiest way to do it. Sending grain through a pump, especially something like a chugger, is pretty difficult to do. I've done a couple decoction mashes. They're fun. They're very time consuming. Very, very time consuming. I mean, you're looking at probably a 3 or 4 hour mash instead of an hour. So you're adding 3 to 4 hours on your brew day. But they can be fun for sure. And I think they do make a difference. A lot of brewers will say that they don't make a difference in today's grain. You're wasting your time. You're wasting your effort. I think it does make a difference. Zwei does a lot of stuff with decoction, I believe, or maybe it's Prost. One of those two does. But I think that they really do make a difference. So then the last thing is a turbid mash. So turbid mashes are typically going to be made for mixed culture stuff. And what you're really trying to do there is extract starch, some long chain sugars that normal yeast cannot eat. And that's going to give some food for your Brettanomyces and your other bacteria to chew on in the extended aging period. So what you're trying to do there, instead of release these proteins, is going to be release starches and not convert those proteins. So Milk the Funk has a very, very good turbid mash how-to. Basically, they have a couple of different write-ups, and one's from Cantillon that's extremely useful. But basically the gist of it is you're going to pull, instead of grains, you're going to pull some starch off, some wort, and then you're going to boil 4 to 5% of it. You're going to leave that, and then you're going to continue your mash rests, your mash steps, and then you're going to add it back in. And basically what you're trying to do is denature that stuff, and you're also going to pull a shit ton of tannins from the mash with really high sparge water. Really hot and really extended sparging is going to pull tannins, which are going to give some stuff for the bacteria and the mixed culture stuff to chew on for a long time. And you're really looking to have some food, like I said, for the extended aging process, because a typical goose, which is a lambic, is going to be a blend of 3-year-old, 2-year-old, and 1-year-old mixed culture spontaneous stuff. So you really have to have stuff for that Brettanomyces to eat on for 3 years or somewhere in that range, over a year. And if you just put a 148 single infusion, that most of that yeast, most of that Saccharomyces is going to just eat it right up, and there's going to be nothing left, and you're not going to get much character out of it. Are you muted?
Yeah, my cursor disappeared. Like I can see stuff like kind of randomly lighting up all over the screen. It's like I'm back in Windows 95 or some shit. I don't know how I got into the time machine, but off we went. Okay, so I think the last thing we were really going to dive into on the advanced technique side was barrel aging, which I know you touched on a little bit as far as the mixed culture goes, but we're also not very known for our mixed culture program either, despite the small success that we've had. It's more from the stout side. Any thoughts there as far as, can you use some chips? Can you use barrels? Can you use this? Can you use that, etc.?
Yeah, so with barrel aging, it's really becoming super popular. I mean, obviously those barrel aged stouts, which is mostly what I'll talk on, is getting to the point where you can't release enough of them. One thing that I would say is, from a homebrewing level, you have way more options than a professional level does. Professionally, you pretty much have two options, which are going to be bourbon barrels, which almost everybody, that's exclusively what they use, and then some giant spirals that you can buy, which we've used one time in the Chardonnay brut that we did, which was pretty cool. So on a homebrew scale, I kind of touched on it earlier, you have options of smaller barrels. So if you don't have the equipment, which most people don't, to brew 53 gallons at a time to fill a bourbon barrel, you can find smaller barrels. You can find those 5 gallons, those 10 gallons. 15s are really popular. I have, I think, about 50, I have 2 15s, a 10, and like 3 or 4 5s. But I got them all locally, which is pretty cool. That's usually where I like to get them, because if you buy them online, you don't really know what you're getting. The best thing I can say to barrel age stuff is always keep your barrel full. If you let your barrel dry out, it's going to be really hard to get it back. If you do let it dry out, one thing you can do is get your bathtub when your wife's out of town, fill it full of hot water, and fill the barrel full of hot water, and just let it sit. That's the best way to do, is have it completely encapsulated with water inside and out, and it will swell back up over time, and it will hold water. Just kind of replace it. Replace that hot water when it cools down, and it will swell up over a day or two to where it holds water. Because if you have some pretty bad stuff, if you have some, when it dries up, those staves shrink and it doesn't hold liquid anymore. So that would be the main thing I can say, is like, always keep your barrel full. That's probably the most important if you're going to reuse it over and over. We only use barrels one time for noche. That's pretty much just because it extracts all the bourbon and all the wood character that we want. We don't feel the need to redo it over and over and over. On a homebrewing level, you can use them more than one time. I still have barrels that are probably 5 to 6 years old now. What I've done is I've transitioned them from stout barrels to begin with to sour barrels. So as that stuff goes out, as that char and that the tannins and all the character from the wood is absorbed into the beer, it's pretty much just a holding vessel that's porous that will hold bacteria for me now. So I've got some sour beers that I don't even pitch yeast onto. I just pitch the wort directly into the barrel, and the stuff that's already in there inoculates it and it ferments in the barrel. So it's a pretty cool way to do it, where you can get some really good use out of it, because $100 for basically a aging device for one-time use isn't super effective, cost effective. So that's a really good way to do it. So for barrel aging stuff, it's kind of really changed since I started working at WeldWerks, because I used to think, put a Russian Imperial Stout in there. What else is bigger than that? You really can't do more. And especially with Media Noche, it's kind of comical how much sugar is actually in Media Noche. I think we did an analysis on it, and a 1 ounce pour is 100 calories, I believe. Is that right, Jake? 100 calories for 1 ounce?
Yes.
Like roughly.
Yeah, just shy of it. Yeah, 80 to 100,
Yeah,
depending on the adjuncts.
Yeah, so I mean, it's one of those things where there's so much sugar in that beer. The starting gravity on that is roughly around 40 Plato, which is around 1.30 which in specific gravity, which is, they don't even make hydrometers that can read that high. So it's off the charts. If you go online and try and find a conversion scale that has like list scales, it's not on there. So it's one of those things where it's a relatively new invention to have beers this high in sugar. That being said, there is a lot of residual sugar left over in that. The yeast can't ferment it out. So they typically end at around 19 to 21 Plato, which I believe is like 1080. I might be wrong, but I believe it's around 1080, which is extremely high. That's like a double starting gravity for a double IPA. So what you have there is a ton of sugar, which will add to residual body, and it will definitely give you that characteristic of the new age barrel aged stout. But on a homebrew level, if your barrel's done and you've used it a couple times and you're just not getting what you want out of it, throw a handle of cheap whiskey in there and recondition that barrel, or just add the whiskey at the end of the day to your beer. You're not beholden to the same laws where we can't add alcohol straight to beer. Homebrewers totally can. So, add that whiskey to your beer if that's what you want to get out of it. The other options you can have for wood aging stuff are going to be cubes. So they're oak cubes that you can put in the beer. If you don't want to buy a barrel, those are really good options to put into your fermenter to age it on. You extract extremely fast with those. So that would be, I would try it after a week and try it every couple days to get that oak character. I would also soak them in a whiskey that beforehand to kind of sanitize as well as absorb some of that whiskey flavor. The other option is spirals, which have even more surface area. Because really, when you're absorbing that wood character, it's all about surface area. So the more surface area you have to that wood, the faster it's going to extract. So spirals are extremely fast. The nice thing about spirals is you can put them into glass carboys. So you can, if you just have a glass carboy, a spiral will fit in there easy and they're pretty easy to get out. Oak cubes are a little bit harder. Same thing there. I would definitely soak that in whiskey before I use it, just to sanitize as well as absorb some of that whiskey flavor.
Got it. My cursor's back, everyone. Don't worry. Don't freak out. Marissa has a great question. At the homebrew level, what yeast are you using to get the highest ABV? California ale yeast seems to die out around 10% for me, and even though White Labs says alcohol tolerance to 15%. And one thing that I will add on here before Wade spreads his knowledge about is at least from WeldWerks perspective, ABV is relatively unimportant to us, and there's actually, we're taking steps for the bottles that are not going to Tavor or are going to be distributed out of the state. They're not required to have ABV on them, and we're actually considering removing that off of there intentionally for a couple of reasons. One, we just kind of view it like IBUs, how there was this chase to it's 170,000 IBUs. At the end of the day, it's a non-important signifier for what the beer ultimately is. When you're crafting a great beer, you're not crafting it to say, boy, I just want there to be this gnarly alcohol smell coming out of it when I take a big whiff. Now, do some people like the fact that they can have 4 ounces of a huge barrel-aged stout and get buzzed? Sure, I bet they do. But at the end of the day, we are looking at the conglomeration of barrel character and mouthfeel, and if there are adjuncts, the adjunct presence and how true it is to the flavor that should be there. These are the targets that we're aiming for, not necessarily for ABV. And we, and again, I mean, I can tell you without question or reservation, they all hit between 12 and 14% in one way or another. But it's not a great signpost or a definitive signpost in any way of what the quality of that beer ultimately is. That said, Marissa's question still stands, Wade. So what would you say about yeast that can kind of tolerate these higher sugar levels?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you said is super important. I think even on a homebrew scale, it's nice to know your ABV to where you can say, hey, I can have a couple of these and be responsible. But I think it's more about the flavor and what you're trying to get out of the beer. And alcohol kind of comes secondary if you're really trying to produce a craft and you're trying to make the best you can. Because, I could go out there and make a 25% ABV by spoon feeding a beer, all day long. But it's one of those things that's going to be super fusel and yeah, it'll get you drunk, but it's not going to taste good. So I think ABV kind of comes secondary, like you said, or even third, or it's not that important to me as a home brewer. So one of those things, as far as the yeast tolerance, I would say the main thing, and there's a really good video from Craft Beer and Brewing by Corey King from Side Project, who I mean, if you don't know Corey King, he's probably the barrel whisperer. Like that dude, he can make some insanely good barrel-aged stouts. It's insane how he does it. But one thing that he talks about in that video is having a very slow and steady fermentation. It's not about having it rip and just kill it and, super active. You really want it to go slow and steady, and just kind of, you get better flavors and you get higher attenuation doing that. Having really good oxygenation is going to help you a ton. On those really thick beers, it's really hard to oxygenate well. Noche is so thick that the oxygen kind of just bubbles in it. It doesn't really absorb into that liquid. There's just too much sugar. It's too thick. But doing that and doing the best you can to oxygenate it is the best. We use USO5 from Safale, US or SO5. So it'd be like, it's a dry yeast. We use it one time. It's first generation. If you're having issues with it dying out, I would say pitch more. You're producing it and you're giving it a very strenuous environment for it, with all that sugar to try and convert to ethanol. Ethanol kills yeast. So it's one of those things that you have to have enough of it that it can tolerate it. So if you're using a USO5 or, and you're just not having that attenuation that you want, and you want it drier, because that's really all that it comes down to is, if it's stopping before you want it to, it's just going to be sweeter. I would pitch more and I would oxygenate more, and I would probably lower my temp. We usually ferment Noche around 65, which is pretty cool. And it keeps it chugging along. It usually takes a couple weeks. 2 to 3 weeks is usually primary on that stuff. So then we cold crash it and put it into barrels. So it's not really a short-term beer by any means. So give it some time as well. It will slowly creep down.
Heard. Thank you. One small note I want to make, since totally off topic, but still semi on topic, at least for the locals around here. Just as a token of gratitude for holding on with us, or going through this whole journey with us that we appreciate so much. Just FYI, I just kind of got a ping from everyone. So the way that our online sale of beer works is, in order to avoid a total clusterfuck in the morning that it goes on sale, we do put them onto the online ordering website the night after we close. We've currently, in the past 45 minutes since close, gone through 25 cases of the other half collab. So that shit's going fast. So if you are interested in getting some, I would highly advise doing so pretty much right now. We'll probably ratchet the limits down, not immediately, but sooner than later. So right now it's a case per person, but just an FYI, just heads up, she's gonna go fast, this one will. But I missed a question from Coach. It's still on the stout question. What about your grain recommendations? He said, I've heard that roasted barley should be limited, and some also advocate for the use of debittered black malt. Are there any other grains that you would recommend using?
Yeah, so I would agree that roasted barley, I mean, it's super bitter. So you want to keep that relatively low. Noche does have a little bit of it in there. One thing that is super, super important, and I've listened to a lot of podcasts with Neil on it, even before I worked at WeldWerks. And one thing that he definitely always recommends for barrel-aged stouts is going to be a lot of oats. He said that he would probably never brew a barrel-aged stout without oats in it. And honestly, I can agree with that, as far as it gives it a velvety mouthfeel, that if that's what you're after, and you're after this new age stout, that oats are going to be your friend. We also use some chocolate rye. We use some DRC is pretty awesome stuff from Simpsons. We also use some pale chocolate, and then a lot of it is pale malt as well. So you really want to have a lot of that diversity in your grain bill to get different stuff out. But yeah, I would say oats are probably number one I would always include. That will become an issue in your mash tun if you're not used to using oats. I would definitely add some rice hulls to help prevent get a stuck mash. So oats would be the one that I would recommend. If you're just looking for color, my favorite malt to use for just color is going to be Midnight Wheat. That adds almost no bitterness to it. which is awesome. So like if you're in it, but it's very potent. So it's one of those things, like if you're using midnight wheat, you don't need a lot of it to get that color, but it does add color without adding any bitterness.
Thank you, sir. Plus I know it's pale chocolate.
Yeah, we use pale chocolate.
Okay.
And chocolate rice.
All right, so let's move slightly past. We're closing in on an hour here, so we can move through. How about a couple of hops things real quick? I think we had talked about hops growing our own before, or no, not growing our own. No, we didn't really. More hops was kind of using them in the kettle and whatnot. So say dry hopping. Hit two things on hopping maybe. So dry hopping and any kind of just general thoughts on farming your own hops as well. And then maybe we can close it out if there aren't too many more questions on banking our yeast cultures if we're starting to create those on our own. So dry hopping and growing our own hops, and then moving into some yeast banking.
Yeah, absolutely. So dry hopping, pretty much we dry hop the fuck out of everything. There's not really much else to say. You know, Juicy Bits, I believe, is around 7 pounds per barrel, which is huge. And that's just our base Juicy Bits. I think extra gets up to 13, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a lot. Those are all new school varieties, such as Mosaic, Eldo, and Citra. That's pretty much the base. We also get into some fancier hops, such as Nelson, Galaxies, and those expensive hops. But as far as dry hopping, what I would say is you want to do it in stages. So typically I'll do 3 dry hops on a New England. I'll do it while fermentation is starting to slow down. I don't really subscribe to a lot of that dry hop right when you at high Kreuzen, where you get a lot of biotransformation. I just think that you're losing a ton of aromatics with the fermentation. You got to think you're blowing off all that CO2 that's going to scrub a lot of those aromatics out of it. And I think you're kind of just wasting your hops to some degree. I think you do get some, and the haze stability is something to talk about with biotransformation. But I think a lot of it you're wasting, especially at the cost point of a lot of these hops. You're just kind of wasting it at that point. So typically, with Juicy Bits, we'll do it 9 days out. So that's 9 days before we transfer. 5 days out, so 4 days later, and then 3 days out. And those are going to be smaller at the beginning and smaller at the end. The big dry hop is going to be that 5-day out dry hop. What that's really going to do is give it time to, extract what it needs. But if you dry hop the hell out of it and then, keg that beer, it's going to have a lot of hop burn, which I've had a lot of friends that are homebrewers talk to me lately about hop burn because they're getting a ton of it. We had a really bad issue with hop burn, I would say, last year. And that was really just because we hadn't dialed in our process so much. One thing that you can do to stop with the hop burn is do a lot of true dumps, get it off of that yeast, get it off of that hop matter. Before you package it, that's really going to help out a ton. And then just give it a little bit, hop burn will go away eventually. I think a lot of our beers last year were better the week after they got released, just because the hop burn went away. And I think in general, most IPAs are really going to be better, a week or so after their package is really when they start hitting their stride. So, having that time, give it some time, and then also get it off the vegetal matter, so to speak. But one thing that we do, and I even do it at home, is when I dry hop, if it's done fermenting, I'll spoon it. So basically what that means is you cut off the blow off. You have to have a vessel that can take pressure in order to do that. But what that does is that traps the aromatics in that container and doesn't let it get out pretty much. So you're trapping it inside that beer. So doing that, I think, is pretty beneficial. As far as growing your own hops, I grow my own hops. I got 4 varieties that I have. They're about 5 years old. I bought them from High Hops in Windsor. As plants, you can also buy them online as rhizomes. Basically, hops will grow as a vine, not a vine. So they do need a matter to grow up. So a vine with a V can actually grow up the side of a house. It has little suckers that suck on the stuff. A hop is a vine with a V, and so it has little hairs, but it needs something to grab onto. So I use hemp rope to have it grow up, and I have a trellis that I made. The cool thing about hops is they're really easy to take care of once you get them established. Mine are about 5 years old, and they grow about a foot a day right now. So they are crazy growers, and they don't need a lot of water. I think I've watered mine 3 times in the last year. So it's one of those things where they're really cool. The one thing I will say is a lot of people want to get like, where can I get Citra hops to grow at home? You can't. Those are going to be a proprietary plant that they have under trademark for pretty much the life. I mean, I think there might be an extension period where they eventually go public, but they're going to be almost impossible to get. There are some USDA hops that are made that you can definitely get. Chinook grows really, really good. Chinook is my #1 grower. It will produce like tens of pounds of hops for me a year off one plant. A great resource is a Reddit page called, I think it's just called Growing Hops or something like that. But Reddit has some good stuff. There's also a book out there about growing your own hops. There's some really cool information, but growing your own hops is really cool, especially because you can make a wet hop beer hop yard. Thanks, coach. Growing your own hops are really cool because I've made a couple wet hop IPAs where you actually go and harvest the hops, don't dry them out, and just put them straight into a beer. It's pretty cool. So yeah, try and grow your hops. They're pretty fun. And they also, if you set it up right, they can shade your house, and they're pretty cool looking.
Awesome. Before we jump over to yeast making, Coach had another question. Kind of maybe like thought philosophy behind creating the different hop blends, and you know why to go with this versus that. Obviously, it's, you know, Citra Mosaic and Eldorado is our big winner. Which, you know, even part of that at the time was just because it's what made sense for us and the contracts that we had 4 years ago. So it's not like some magic combination that, you know, it's one that we knew would be successful, but it also was, you know, slightly by dint of force or luck or chance or whatever you want to call it. But how do you approach, maybe from the recipe formation side, blending different hop varietals together along the way?
Yeah, so like I would say start off with the descriptors, YCH and BSG and all those guys. They have a lot of information on their websites on what these hops smell and taste like. If you have a specific profile you're going after, then I would definitely look at those. And then a lot of it is trial and error. It's one of those things where you can look at other people's recipes and see how much they're using. That would be a good thing that I would do when I would look for recipe formulation. But a lot of it is going to be, you know, messing around with them. You find a hop that you like and you kind of stick with it. Citra is kind of a cheat code hop to me. I think pretty much any beer with Citra in it is, you know, going to be a winner. There's one of those things where it's year over year, Citra is just amazing. It's kind of crazy. But that's kind of what I would go after. You know, Citra is super citrusy. Mosaic can be a little more berry, earthy. I get a lot of earth off of Nelson as well. With Nelson, I pretty much will never use it singularly by itself. It's easier because I just don't like the flavor of Nelson by itself. I think it's really good with Citra or Eldorado or something like that. But a lot of it's going to be trial and error. And just kind of messing with your recipe as you go. That's kind of the point of advance, is you're tweaking stuff and trying to figure out where you want to go with that.
Perfecto. You know, let's close it out quickly. Any last questions you want to get in about anything, folks? Go ahead and toss those up. But if you want to touch very briefly on yeast banking and whatnot, yes, James, I'll get to that in just a second. Go ahead and rock out some quick yeast banking tips or thoughts, and then we'll call it a night.
Yeah, so yeast banking, what you're really going to do there is your long-term storage of your yeast cells. So like, say you did a spontaneous thing that you really like the flavor of, you can take some of that yeast troop and you're going to actually store it long-term. So you can freeze yeast if you have it in the right conditions, where you're going to create an agar that it can grow on, and you're going to put it in a test tube with a lot of surface area. So it's going to be slanted, and that's why they call them slants, to where it can actually have a lot of surface area and be stable in that environment. It's one of those things that this is probably the most advanced part of homebrewing, I would say, is banking your own yeast, because you're taking these single cells and you're going to grow them up into a usable pitch. It's one of those things that it takes a lot of effort and a lot of know-how. a good resource is going to be Yeast, the book, as well as Milk the Funk has some stuff on it. And there's just a lot of really good information if you look out there. I personally don't bank anything because yeast is cheap enough, and I don't have anything that's special enough, in my opinion, that I keep. But I know that it's one of those things that if you want to get into it, you know, if you're a lab guy, it can be very, very rewarding. You can isolate stuff. You can, the Milk the Funk group on Facebook, those guys are crazy as far, like they're all chemists. It's crazy. So definitely check those guys out if you want some more yeast information, as well as the book Yeast is a great resource.
Awesome. Two quick questions. One I forgot to address before from John J, who's asking just about distro for us. Do you distribute in Iowa or any state out east? Iowa, we do not. Any state out east, yes, we definitely do. Depends on what you're how you're defining that. Minnesota, Illinois, Massachusetts, Florida, Virginia, and I believe soon to be Georgia. Now, when we say we distribute, that is not the same thing as saying that WeldWerks beer is readily available at these locations. We work with people that we have worked with in the past for bringing beer in for festivals in order to, and you find good relationships. It's a big confusing system that's fraught with peril. And when you find folks who care about the beer, care about about your brand, and you feel they can take good care of you, you send them more beer whenever you can. So it is not this like, we always have beer in Chicago. Usually what happens is we'll send anywhere from 1 to, 4 or 5 pallets out. They're pre-sold before they hit the ground, and then they're off the shelves usually within about a week. So you're not talking about some massive drops or anything like that. It became more in the past 2 months as we were adjusting to COVID and just making sure that we were taking care of our staff and whatnot. We wanted to keep revenue coming in, so we ramped it up, but now it's going to go back down until we decide to eventually ramp up production in one way or another. But not Iowa, I'm sorry. And then the Colorado Springs Tap House is, I wouldn't say indefinite hold, but we are completely beholden to the permitting process, and until the government is able to, it's just the whole process slowed to a halt as far as getting our building permits and demo permits and all the stuff that we needed in order to adequately move forward. And so until the government's open back up and are doing more normal business, the type of stuff that we do, they don't really give a shit about. Not that I blame them. It's just not high on their priority list to take care of like the new brewery who wants to come into town. So we have everything ready. I mean, the place is designed, everything is picked out. I mean, we worked on this for months and months and months and months. So literally, as soon as we can pull the trigger, it's like almost like a cartoonish, like whirling dervish sort of thing, and it'll turn from that kind of like shithole that it looks like right now into this beautiful bastion of craft beer fun and delight. But God, if I could even try to guess at a date, I would, but I can't, unfortunately, because everyone I've tried to guess at has been wrong for the past 2 years. So there are just a couple last questions. How can homebrewers help out to raise money for charity like some breweries are doing? Unless you know something. I don't know.
Yeah, so I got a couple things. So specifically with Colorado and a lot of these, like the Altogether IPA that we brewed, I believe those recipes are available to the public. So you could brew those and just raise awareness. It's one of those things where you can, raise awareness to those charities, give it the beers to your friends, be like, hey, if you like this beer, this is for this cause, and you can donate some money, not to me, because that'd be illegal selling my home beer. But if you could do that, you could donate directly to the cause. Like Craig said, you can buy local. That's huge. It's one of those things that if you are helping support local businesses, especially in this time, it's extremely important. Whether it be a brewery or a homebrew shop or anything of that matter, or even your local liquor store, all of these are really important versus buying from these big corporations that can really take the hit. These small mom and pop guys are really going to be the ones that are hurting at the end of the day versus, your big liquor store chains and stuff like that.
Agreed, sir. Well, folks, I think that just about wraps it up for at least the first iteration of Wort Wranglin with Wade. This could be considered. Yeah. This is going to be an ongoing thing. We've actually just spun up branding for it. We're creating a separate page on our website for it. There's the entire Dialed In with WeldWerks series will become more of a thing even post COVID. It's a great way to connect with people differently now that we're lucky enough to have a really awesome fan base that is not just in Colorado, but is a bit more geographically dispersed. That is a blessing and an honor, and we want to make sure that we stay in touch with every single one of those folks as much as our beautiful locals that we love so much. So huge thanks and props to Wade for taking the time, especially at such a crazy fucking time in your life, to share your knowledge and to drop some cool shit on everybody. We'll probably be back. We'll maybe kind of let this kind of hang out for a few months, maybe see if Wade can get more than 4 consecutive hours of sleep in a night. And then once that is actively happening, maybe we can try and dive into it again with some fresh eyes. So keep an eye out for everything else coming down the Dialed In side. We're going to keep having fun with it and trying to do some good, important work for hopefully people who care. So we appreciate you all so much. As is customary, I'm going to go out tonight, little Granddad 114. I was going to go. I actually just got a bottle of 1792 sweet wheat, but I thought that actually putting that up to my lips and chugging it would just, it's almost like sacrilege. I couldn't bring myself to do it. So the old Granddad 114 is going straight down the gullet. Appreciate y'all. And until the next time I see you, that's when I'll see you. Cheers.
Cheers, guys. I would say if you guys have any information that you really want to go over, email me or Jake, and I'll either get back to you, or if there's a lot of it, then maybe we can do another series on specific stuff. I think that'd be really fun. So.
And to piggyback off that, Wade and I have fielded a good handful of questions just via email. So, but don't feel don't be bashful about sending us a question. We're happy to do whatever we can to keep the community rolling and rocking and whatnot. So, thank you guys. Have a great night, and we'll catch you next time.
Cheers, guys.